Anthony, and thanks very much for inviting me to give this some remarks on this issue, which has been really kind of close to my heart through unfortunately over 30 years of work on environmental protection. So as you mentioned, I started my career on environmental democracy in WWF in the 1990s, and I was working looking at community control of resources like forests or parks, mangroves all over the world. And wherever we worked, it was clear that both livelihoods and ecosystems were being systematically undermined by poor governance, local corruption, and global economic forces, all of which overwhelmed local communities' ability to organize their own life and run traditional management systems. On that, I moved into the Foreign Office, which was setting up a new environment policy department. And there I worked directly on implementing the Aarhus Convention. I established a Foreign Office fund on environmental, worked extensively with Marta and others in Eastern Europe and in Ukraine, actually. And we created, again, with one of your other sponsors, WRI, a regrettably short-lived international partnership for Principle 10 at the World Summit on Sustainable Development in 2002. But I discovered actually the UK government had a rather mixed approach to environmental democracy then. It was doing real path-breaking work on illegal timber, banning trade, but also helping bottom-up community rights in exporting countries. But also one of my biggest arguments in government was with the Foreign Office Human Rights Department, who were strongly against promoting environmental rights at the UN, which has just been agreed last year, seeing it as a dilution of the focus on political rights. So they're seeing environmental democracy being anti-broader democracy. In other jobs in the UK government, including in the Prime Minister's Strategy Unit, I worked on environmental crime, corruption, organised crime, both of which were central to my work on UK fisheries management, which was a great example of where environmental management fails to be rooted in rule of law or consent of those who are managed, causing really deep problems which we're still struggling to deal with. And finally, my remarks are based on my work at E3G for the last 15 years, where we've been working to deeply analyze the climate politics, what makes countries make decisions on climate in over 35 countries globally, but also working to build coalitions to move change in areas like energy systems, infrastructure, finance, adaptation. And in all of these areas, and all of my experience, the critical issue to solve has not been the technicalities of climate policies, though these of course matter, but the accountability of governments to their population, the transparency of decision-making, and the ability of individuals and communities to have effective access to justice and preservation of their rights. Without these elements of environmental democracy, which are summed up so succinctly in Principle 10 of the Rio Convention, unfortunately not known as well as it should be, any climate policies will be incapable of surviving the kind of opposition and turbulence which is inevitable in the transition to net zero climate resilient societies. And that's the core point I want to make today, is we need to put democratic values, institutional strengthening and governance innovation back at the heart of climate action if we're really serious about protecting everyone from catastrophic climate change. We also need to constantly remind people that we need to get serious about climate action if we want to protect our fragile democratic system and human rights. A world of extreme climate change would undermine national and international legal systems as shocks and shortages turn people and societies inwards and elevate the politics of fear and power over rules and cooperation. Tackling climate change is not just an environmental issue, it's a democratic civilization issue. And we need to spell out these threats, not in order to scare people, but in order to motivate the kind of cross-society coalitions of actions we need to limit climate change to safe enough levels and build resilience of those unavoidable impacts. It really isn't enough to follow the science. Anyone seriously concerned with climate change must also work to rewrite the way societies make critical collective decisions. And that work has to go far beyond the narrow climate, energy, transport, and environmental policies to tackle fundamental issues of rights, control, devolution, compensation, and accountability. And reflecting on this speech, my real concern is these vital issues are currently not high in the priorities of climate actors, whether they're governments or businesses or activists, as they need to be. Despite the recent rise in climate mobilization, there's still a tendency to focus on technocratic responses and stakeholderism, ignoring more fundamental issues of accountability and representation. Indeed, while the very important Glasgow Pact calls for engagement with youth and Indigenous peoples, it fails to even mention elected legislators, the constitutional backbone of democracies. When issues of democracy and accountability are raised, they mainly seem to focus on stopping the influence of fossil fuel companies on government policy. This is important, but its impact is slightly blunted by the fact that governments themselves actually own over 80% of global fossil reserves. Governments are the largest fossil companies in most parts of the world, and it's their accountability that is necessary. So I want to really, in my remarks, cover 4 critical points. Firstly, environmental democracy is in retreat across the world, driven by the broad rise in authoritarianism, but also specific environment factors. This requires urgent work to support and defend these rights and the environmental defenders who are often at risk. Secondly, that strengthening environmental democracy is mission critical for solving climate change. More accountability, transparency, and access to justice will be needed to shape the deep reforms needed for rapid decarbonisation and preserve political support for climate transformations. But on the other hand, climate change is also an opportunity to build alliances with broader groups focused on accountability, anti-corruption, good governance. The global changes driven by climate action open the door to powerful new alliances for democratic change, which we must put central to our action. To build a reliable basis for climate action, there's a need to properly integrate environmental democracy approaches across climate policy, governance, financing, and have much franker discussions about the system conditions needed for change. People talk a lot about the seriousness of the climate emergency. Well, that is backed up by a governance emergency we need to tackle. And that's because environmental democracy is in retreat globally. The retreat of democracy and closure of civil society space is well documented over the last 15 years. What's usually less well known is that environmental defenders have now become the largest group of rights activists being attacked and losing their lives, if you look at the Global Witness survey. Partly this is due to a normalization of repression as autocratic societies have risen, but it's also driven specifically by tensions over the use of increasingly scarce productive land for industrial agriculture, access to minerals, and delivery of development projects. Tensions all arise from the same economic and demographic forces that have driven the acceleration of climate change. There has been a rise in disinformation, legal attacks, and information operations by both countries and companies against climate activists. Anti-coal campaigners in particular have faced government surveillance in countries from Poland to India. As decarbonisation deepens and incumbents face significant write-downs in the value of their assets. So it's critical that protections are increased before these stresses hit, keeping space for civil society and citizens' action open. This also means prioritising environmental democracy inside diplomatic relations, both climate and human rights driven, and within political party families, in city-to-city relationships, and broad governmental, non-governmental diplomacy networks. We need a whole-of-society approach to this engagement. International norms need to be reaffirmed and supported much more explicitly, not least because the proportion of greenhouse gases from countries with closed civil society space and low levels of democratic governance will rise by 2030 to cover over 80% of global greenhouse gas emissions. Democracies are cutting emissions, autocracies are growing emissions. That's where the issues lie for all of our safety in the future. And that just starts to show why environmental democracy is so critical for delivering our climate security. It isn't just the right thing to do, it's mission critical for the climate transitions we need. And just to remind you, keeping climate change to 1.5 degrees requires fundamental transformation of all global energy, industrial, transport, infrastructure, and agricultural systems in the next 3 decades. Now, climate analysis often talks about the material and financial conditions for this, how many trillions of dollars, how many gigawatts of solar panels, but rarely about the changes needed to governance, regulatory, administrative, legal, and business systems. And that's a critical mistake, because many of the current systems that decide on infrastructure, energy, and urban planning are controlled by small groups of entrenched incumbents, often with tacit or openly corrupt relationships. And without reforms to deliver responsive, adaptive, innovative, and public interest-focused governance, it'll be impossible to achieve the change at the pace needed. Put simply, if we can't make good decisions about the present, how will we be able to make good decisions about the future? So delivering on the net zero promises made in Glasgow needs to start by asking if national and subnational governance systems are fit for purpose, and if not, then what reforms are needed. And this change needs to happen immediately. It can't be put off. Governance reform require patient and relentless work. It took over a decade to reform the European Union's gas network planning system, which was completely controlled by incumbent operators, just to make its future gas demand forecasts and financing consistent with the EU's legal targets. It also took years of freedom of information requests and forensic analysis to uncover that the energy models being used by the European Commission were systematically undervaluing the potential of household energy efficiency, making higher targets look more expensive and less achievable. And even the Commission hadn't understood those assumptions until it was made publicly transparent. And I use these examples not because the EU is badly governed compared to other systems, it isn't, but because even in a sophisticated and open system like the EU, there are deeply entrenched interests and assumptions that need reform to meet the hugely ambitious pace of change we need. With no disrespect to my friends in the UK Climate Change Committee Secretariat, the most important aspect of their work is not their often brilliant analysis, but the fact they report to Parliament and the burden of proof is on the executive to justify change in their recommendations. This has represented a quasi-constitutional change to the UK governance system, creating a new space for public debate with full transparency for legislators and the public. The fact that similar institutions have been created in over 40 countries show there is beginning to be an understanding of the need for permanent governance reform to drive the climate transition. Important as climate assemblies have been in some jurisdictions, especially to set targets, permanent bodies are needed to support the long arc of change over the coming decades. And again, it's not that countries with poor democratic systems or low levels of transparency can't make some good technical decisions. In some way, that's the easy part. It's that all governments make mistakes or have to respond to unexpected changes while become beholden to incumbent interests, ideas, and assumptions. Climate change is full of known unknowns, as Don Rumsfeld put it. We know we will be surprised by technologies, delivery failure, public attitudes and resistance, and the complex, interlinked and emerging impacts of a changing climate. Climate change cannot afford to solve these problems by slowly muddling through or waiting for incumbents to retire or be outcompeted. Winning slow on climate is losing. Only open, accountable and transparent governance can help institutions, both public and private, adjust to a pace of change far faster than they naturally want to move. And the bottom line is countries with responsive and flexible governance will be best placed to win the net zero competitiveness race and build effective resilience to unavoidable climate impacts. So environmental democracy is vital to delivering the quality of governance needed to reach net zero in time. Even basically authoritarian governments or those deeply entangled with fossil fuel interests will face pressures to adjust and adapt to this reality over time. But improving environmental democracy is also vital to maintain political support for deep decarbonisation over the coming decades. Whatever you may hear in the media, achieving net zero is remarkably cheap for most countries who are not large oil and gas producers. The cost has fallen to well under 1% of GDP compared to over 40 to 60% of GDP being spent in the public purse in most advanced economies. Compared to funding pensions and healthcare, climate change is relatively cheap and great value for money. But that doesn't tell the whole story. Beneath these small additional costs are huge transitions which will create winners and losers across societies. Coal miners cannot easily switch to becoming and building wind turbines. Electric cars are so reliable that 2/3 of car mechanics will lose their jobs. As we shift consumption patterns, people will be asked to change who have very different ability and capability. Climate impacts from floods, storms, heat waves will increase and access to affordable insurance will shrink even further. At a societal level, these transitions could be theoretically managed fairly, but the question, will they be? Who will win and who will lose? Who is protected and who will pay? Who is deciding and who is consulted? Every country will need to define a new social contract that is seen fair in principle and practice by their population. Without such clarity, and especially if groups feel their interests are ignored, climate action will face public backlashes, often encouraged by politically hostile or partisan forces. For example, some analysts suggest around 70% of the Gilets Jaunes social media reach was generated by Russian state information operations. Here in the UK, failure to build support for UK onshore wind farms, backed by fossil industry lobbying, halted construction of UK's cheapest form of clean energy for over a decade, a decision only now being revisited due to the Ukraine crisis. And it goes on, the biggest barrier for the next stage of European decarbonisation is public consent to grid rollout, smart technology and use of personal data, radical changes in homes and consumption. Sustainable support for these big changes requires trust in government and open consultation. It's not an issue of whether people support climate policy in the abstract, but this imperative being overridden by other more direct concerns about economic impacts and unfairness. And similar considerations happen when we're looking at supporting interests in transition. Studies across Europe show that bad outcomes happen when governments intervene late with specific firms, but good outcomes on just transition come when you involve whole communities and regions early in the transition. Better environmental democracy is the how of just transition, which we need to move forward. And finally, the issue of procedural and legal fairness is particularly stark when dealing with adaptation and recovery from climate impacts. Governance systems for climate resilience are weak, including in advanced and middle income countries, as the cruelly disasters we saw in China, Japan, the US, Canada, and Germany in 2021 shown. Meanwhile, other countries like Bangladesh have invested in good governance and responsiveness and massively improved their resilience in the last decade. Resilience is a result of good governance, not just wealth, which you would not understand if you attended the UNFCCC talks. And the governance failures on resilience stem from three core failures of environmental democracy. Firstly, a lack of clear rights for protection and compensation, including countries like the UK, US, and Germany, where no compensation comes unless there are huge disasters, as we saw with 40 billion euros for the German floods last year. But people impacted by slow onset or distributed disasters, or those with weak rights or low rights to the resources they have or access to courts, no compensation. There's a lack of transparency on climate risk data, not just for technical reasons, but because in some countries, for example, water use data is a national security aspect, and many cities are worried about putting out climate risk data in fear that real estate prices will fall. It's a big issue on the east coast of the US. And finally, there's a lack of consultation with climate impacted groups who tend to be scattered and diverse, not well organized. National hazards are often dealt with at different levels. There's no single agency. In the countries we've studied, all 35 of them, the consistent result is the voice of climate impacted groups systematically underrepresented in climate debates. And this legal asymmetry between the climate impacted and fossil fuel groups in defining national policy is perhaps one of the most critical barriers to effective, rapid climate action. So if stronger governance and accountability is critical for climate action, then the flip side is also true. The existential nature of climate change and the huge changes it's driving through economic, political, and social systems opens the door to major advances in democratic accountability and new big tent coalitions for change. In many countries, people understand big infrastructure decisions have corruption, but if it just results in 10% higher costs, it doesn't create a backlash. For that, you need a big impact. Failure to account for climate change and infrastructure potentially reaches the threshold for public attention, because poor decisions will lead to a generation of polluting, stranded, and vulnerable assets which will need to be replaced before the end of their working life, as we've seen in South Africa with the failure of the Eskom utility due to overinvestment in coal. And we're seeing these kind of joint public demonstrations come out in Costa Rica. It's a fascinating movement called Costa Rica Limpia, which is protesting against vested interests blocking electrification and improvement of public transport in favor of fossil fuels. But beyond animating public process, climate change also gives potential to leverage the huge power of financial actors to scrutinize the quality of decisions and how they align with climate goals and impacts. Most major investors are now committed to managing climate risk and reporting. BlackRock apparently has 100 people working on climate impacts analysis. They also have a requirement at directors level to take into account these risks, which is backed up by legal liability, which public interest lawyers and shareholders are moving forward. As climate risk becomes more prevalent in the financial sector, we'll see pressure on both public and private sectors to improve their governance and risk management and align themselves with the public interest and public targets. There's huge potential for synergies between climate and governance actors, but groups who currently have few connections. This will avoid climate change and the climate movement trying to reinvent the governance wheel, but also will build those kind of big coalitions we need for governance reforms. So that's the core framework. We need to do better environmental democracy to solve climate change, but also offers huge opportunities. I wouldn't want to give a huge policy speech. This is more opening remarks, but there are sets of issues we should look. We should incorporate the principles of environmental democracy into NDCs and processes. We should support more strongly establishing climate change committee oversight institutions around the world with explicit mandates for public engagement. We should encourage legislators to oversee infrastructure decisions more strongly and make sure they're consistent with climate goals and projections. A legal right to know your climate risk would underpin the impacted groups, and requirements to ensure explicit resource rights for vulnerable groups if you're going to deliver international adaptation support. And even intergenerational ombudsman and people coming up to help future generations have a voice at the equation. These are the types of actions that should be priorities for our climate cooperation to lay the basis for real change. We've now ended the first stage of climate action in setting targets and objectives for every country in the world. We're now getting into the difficult delivery stage, where opposition, competing priorities, and institutional inertia will need to be overcome against the backdrop of increased climate damage and broader geopolitical turbulence, which we can't avoid. A credible and politically resilient transition requires the buffers, checks, and balances provided by democratic and accountable systems. Stronger environmental democracy is not just an optional extra, it's the only way to deliver a safe climate for everyone. Thanks very much.